We have 4 Cyberpunk 2077 test sequences devised by CD Projekt Red buried within the PC version of the game, using the cross-save system to port saved data between consoles and PC. We've discovered that these sequences are available in all versions of the game, primarily to test streaming systems if the file names are anything to go by. The official PC benchmark is one of those sequences, and yeah, we've been able to get that running on all consoles too, even PlayStation 4 and PS4 Pro. And in fact, we're going to start with that sequence because while many of the other tests were seemingly designed for stress testing the streaming system, this one was clearly designed to be multi-purpose, hence it becoming public-facing in the PC version of the game. It's also the most well-behaved test, if you like, with most of the target platforms running at the appropriate frame rates with few, if any, drops. PlayStation 4 drops just 4 frames in the sequence. PS4 Pro drops just 2, while the other systems have a completely clean run. So at that point, dynamic resolution scaling comes into the mix. We've highlighted the DRS windows with the labeling there. But what about actual pixel counts at any given point? Looking right at the beginning of the bench here with Switch 2, PS4 and PS4 Pro, some fascinating results. PS4 at 864p, but the Professional and the Nintendo console in docked mode delivering 1080p. But here's the thing, Series S is also at 1080p. And that's interesting, right? Because the dynamic resolution window allows it to upscale to 1440p. So Switch 2 matching Pro and Series S. This is pretty impressive in this particular snapshot. However, load adjusts according to content, right? So taking this shot as an example, we have base PS4 again at 864p, but this time the Pro maxes to its 1188p limit, while Switch 2 drops to 945p. So now it's at a kind of midpoint between PS4 and Pro and operating below its DRS upper bounds. Meanwhile, Series S is maxing out at 1440p, way ahead. Now let's move back to the interior shot we looked at earlier, but this time with Switch 2 and Series S in 120Hz mode. To hit that consistent 40fps, Switch 2 drops to 600p, while Series S is at 792p. Might not sound like a huge difference, and perceptually maybe it isn't with DLSS in the equation, but the bottom line is that the Series S is pushing 74% more pixels, and it's doing it at 60 frames per second, versus the Switch 2's 40 frames per second. So the gulf is pretty wide there. Maybe that 30fps quality mode comparison, bit of an outlier, we'll see. The thing about dynamic resolution scaling is that it's more dynamic than you may think, and in catching edges to do our pixel counts, we may actually be catching them while the resolution is shifting. The other thing to bear in mind is that DLSS has a computational load of its own, significantly higher, I'd warrant, than what the PS4 and the PS4 Pro are doing. So the gap there between the Sony and Nintendo consoles, well, arguably, Switch 2 is actually doing a lot more. Let's move on now to the classic Kabuki streaming test. In terms of stress testing components, it's good for putting CPU and GPU through their paces. In terms of the overall performance outlook, the 30fps modes for all systems are surprisingly consistent. Switch 2 has minor drops in the first part of the sequence where none of the others do, not even the base PlayStation 4, but I think this can be explained perhaps by the paired back streaming used on last-gen systems. There are obvious level of detail advantages enjoyed by Switch 2 and Series S up against PS4 and Pro, where assets and even city structures are streamed in much later, presumably owing to the much slower storage system on those older consoles. The end of the run takes us into a denser area where PS4 and Switch 2 are struggling to maintain target frame rate, but the Pro is doing fine, as is Series S. For reference, the Pro's CPU is about 30% faster than base, but we're focusing primarily on the GPU side of things here, so how do the pixel counts check out? This is tricky to do because each version has different anti-aliasing techniques in play, so finding raw edges common to all is hard, so credit to my colleague Tom Morgan for finding worthwhile data there. The section here sees the car clip under geometry, giving us obvious edges to check, It's also light on GPU load at 30 FPS, so 900p and 1080p on PS4 and Pro respectively are matched by 1080p, and again, curiously, 1080p on Series S. Switching to the performance modes on Switch 2 and Series S, it's 810p, plays 900p. A 23% advantage for Series S in terms of pixel count, but remember that Xbox is pumping out 60 frames per second up against Switch 2's 40. Going back to the beginning of the sequence here, Tom's pixel counts for this frame give us the following. Again, seemingly minimal GPU load here as we're looking at 900p on PS4, 1080p on Pro, 1080p on Switch 2. Series S though, yeah, we're counting out full fat 1440p at matching 30 FPS output, a 78% boost over Switch 2. Switching to the 40 FPS performance mode, 810p on Series S, plays 648p on Switch 2, a 56% improvement to resolution, but a circa 70% improvement to frame rate on top of that, though there may well be a CPU consideration in play holding back Switch 2, you just don't really know. A final shot here from near the end of the Kabuki sequence where we start to enter a more detail-rich area of the benchmark. Framerate wise, the Switch 2 is starting to buckle even in the 30 FPS quality mode, but the PS4 Pro and Series S do not. Locked 30 FPS there. Still, 864p on PS4, maxed out 1188p on Pro, 936p on Switch 2. Series S here delivers 1080p, a 33% resolution advantage for the Microsoft console over the Switch 2. Interesting stuff in the performance mode though at the same area. 720p on Series S, plays 792p on Switch 2, a 21% Switch 2 advantage. That said, the frame rate readout kind of tells you why possibly. Series S is getting on for doubling Switch 2 performance. A much higher level of pixel throughput then. Okay, so what's the overall conclusion from these tests? Well, there's a decent degree of variability here, but the Switch 2's docked GPU performance up against PlayStation 4, the base PlayStation 4 that is, should be highlighted. On all of our tests, the Switch 2 delivers higher pixel counts, and it's doing so with DLSS anti-aliasing and upscaling versus a less expensive TAA solution on the old Sony console. GPU seems to be considerably more capable. Across all of our test results, Switch 2 is delivering an average 32% improvement in resolution. And of course, that won't be factoring in the GPU load of DLSS. Up against PS4 Pro though, Switch 2 is either on par resolution-wise or considerably lower, a gulf in results that kind of makes an average meaningless. But again, something to bear in mind, no DLSS equivalent on the Pro there. So ultimately though, I guess you can see that Switch 2 falls possibly between PS4 and Pro, though ideally I'd like more data here. And of course, some idea of just how much computational load DLSS is putting on the Switch 2 GPU, which is going to be far less with the TAA solutions used by the PlayStation consoles. Against Series S quality mode though, resolution differences vary from nothing to upwards of 70% in favour of the Series S. The larger numbers may well be down to the fact that we often hit the max 1080p on Switch 2, while Series S never actually goes lower than 1080p. Performance mode head-to-head, all told, an average 73% resolution advantage for Series S, which is targeting 60 frames per second versus Switch 2's 40 frames per second. So based on Cyberpunk 2077 at least then, the concept of Switch 2 providing Series S level GPU performance or something slightly slower or ballpark, I think these numbers say otherwise.